What's that? Howls from the woods, movement under the water, something you notice off the corner of your eye, but you look, it's gone. This is Cryptid Talk. Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing today? I hope you're all having a very fine weekend. Hopefully, you have a good weekend coming up. Sorry, I still have a little bit of a little bit of a I guess a cough still left behind. Whenever I get sick, it always stays behind for forever, and it's never fun because coughs are always very persistent for me. And I think I had a cough that lasted for like 3 or 4 months one time. It was unbearable. But enough about me. Today we got a very important guest today. A man who I've learned so much from over the past few years, good friend of mine, and probably like up there is like one of the top five like smartest people I know when it comes to Bigfoot and the way he talks and the way he presents himself and the topic in general. So everyone, I'd like you all to introduce you to Matt Pruitt. Matt, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. Thanks for the kind words. It's very generous of you. I'll do my best to live up to that.
I mean, of course. I mean, you deserve everything, and even everything, even all above that, and everything. So, so, so yeah. So I guess yeah. Before we really get into it, like how's life just been with you? I know you're in Florida right now with with family, but how's everything else in your world going on?
It's going very well. It's been a busy couple of years, and so I'm looking forward to hunkering down and working on a few projects this year. So I'm taking a big step back and doing a lot of like public speaking and conferences and things like that, so I can focus on finishing a second book and also a lot of field research. So looking forward to getting home and digging into those projects.
Oh, we got another book, yeah. Because I actually do have the book that you did most recently, actually just right next to me. And having so many Bigfoot books and just so many books to read in general, I've actually finally been able to catch up with it, and so far I'm loving it. And so, what's this new book? If you're able to say anything about it.
It'll be a much deeper dive into a lot of the themes and subjects of that first book. The first book sort of lays the groundwork. I didn't want to assume too much prior knowledge. I didn't want to write the kind of book that you had to read five other books first to make sense of. So the first one's a pretty comprehensive analysis of the subject as a whole. For anyone who was brand new to it, they could pick up that book and get a pretty thorough education, at least as far as I was aiming for. And so this would be sort of an extension of that, but going a lot deeper in a few different realms, but without the sort of need to rehash the history of Sasquatchery or the fossil candidates and things of that nature.
Wow, and I mean, just from what I've read so far, and when you've talked about it on your show, this book has already seems like it's already very big, like a big deep dive into the whole subject. Yeah, sure, I know you've said that you've toned it down a little bit for some stuff, but the fact that you're doing something even more than this, my gosh, it feels like if you start doing certain pages in like different languages to really get people to deep dive into it and reading it.
Yeah, it's gonna be a big project. It's probably about a third done at this point. So, but I've just been traveling so much and have had so many commitments and obligations that keep me away from home for the last year and a half, basically. So, we're going to try to hunker down and get a lot of this done this year. So, I don't know if I'll get the whole thing done by the fall or something like that. But basically, between I don't have another speaking event or travel engagement until late September. So, I'm trying to keep the schedule completely clear for being in the field and for working on this.
Wow. Well, I mean, for sure, as soon as it becomes available and I'm able to get it from you, of course, obviously going to support you and buy a copy. So, looking forward to when I'm able to, when that time comes.
Appreciate that very much.
And then you also said, well, I guess you said you got some stuff to you'll be like activities you'll be going to later this year. Do you have any idea or any interest in if you're going back to Kentucky this year?
I don't know if I'll be at CryptidCon this year or not. That remains to be seen. That one is definitely a possibility because I live in Nashville, Tennessee, so that's just right up the road from me. And so, if that opportunity comes up, I will very likely be there.
Yeah, I guess when do you personally get like notified, be like, hey Matt, you want to come to CryptidCon again this year?
Usually, it's a few months in advance, a few months beforehand, as they're putting everything together.
Okay, so it's still a bit too early.
Yeah, I mean, there's pretty much an open invite. We just haven't discussed details yet because I've done it for 4 years in a row now. So, and they did say at the last event, "Oh, we'd love to have you back next year." We just haven't formalized that in any way. So, I'd hate to say like, "Yes, I'll be there" if that's not the case. So, But yeah, usually once that gets firmed up and they announce it, I start sharing that on, the podcast with Cliff and Bobo or other outlets online.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, because the funny thing is that you've actually been going to CryptidCon as long as I have too. I actually we started going about 4 years as well, so it's very good. Just a funny coincidence that we've been going there at the same time.
Yep, that was definitely the first place I met you. Was the first CryptidCon that I ever attended and was asked to host and participate there. And it's always a great opportunity to see friends and especially to see Cliff. Cliff and I, obviously we do this podcast together, but even before that, we would talk on the phone all the time. And when I lived in the Northwest, I'd spend a lot of time with him. But these days, it's usually like events that get us together since we live at opposite ends of the country. So usually that's a big deciding factor when I decide to do an event or not. It's like, oh, well, how many of my friends are going to be there that I wouldn't get to see otherwise? Because, they are big commitments and obligations sometimes, and they're not always convenient. If you have a busy schedule and a lot of other projects going, and like with our podcast, we basically have two podcasts. So we release 2 episodes a week. And so that's a lot of work in terms of recording and editing and lining things up. And we've never missed an episode and never been late, which is pretty miraculous because we're coming up on our 6-year anniversary. So we've done
Wow.
1 episode a week for 6 years and 1 episode a week for 6 years and 2 episodes a week for almost 3 of those years. So it's been a lot.
Yeah, but that's why I've always loved CryptidCon because it's like the big one that we go to every year. We leave at midnight and we drive like the 10-12 hours to there and just get there around noon, which is perfect because we have plenty of time to unwind and relax from the drive, maybe take a nap and everything. But CryptidCon has also just been a good one in general because it's like I think as you guys have said in your show that it just feels like a family reunion of friends getting together who haven't seen each other for a bit, and this might be the only time you ever get a chance to actually have a physical interaction with people, chatting, talking, catching up, and honestly, it's been so much fun. The amount of friends that I've made through there, like including you and the guys from Mountain Monsters and everything, like it's one of the things that I look forward to probably more than anything throughout the entire year. And, of course, we'll be going back again this year, maybe as a vendor, but we'll see.
Yeah, that is one of my favorite things about that event. And the Ohio conference is similar in that everyone's staying under the same roof. The speakers, all the attendees, and so it's like one big long weekend hangout. There's a whole lot of social time and interactions with people. And both of those events, what I think they have in common is like I see a lot of the same faces every year. And so it is like an extended conversation, a continuing dialogue with a lot of people. And so that's a really cool, fun thing. Is like this last year, I saw so many people that I'd met the years prior and remembered, who they were and remember their names. And so that's a lot of fun to have that familiarity rather than just like a whole new batch of strangers each and every time, which is fun too in its own way. But it's nice that reunion feel.
Yeah, for sure. Because actually, this past year when we left, we actually because I set up an extra day off, and we actually stopped in Salt Fork State Forest in Ohio. And just complete coincidence, I knew the Ohio Bigfoot conference was in Ohio, but I actually didn't exactly know where. And just lo and behold, the hotel that we stayed in Salt Fork State Forest was actually where they actually hosted as well. And I'm like, oh crap, what are the odds? So, and that hotel was really nice when we were there just for the night. The bar and the restaurant was great. Just the overall aesthetic and look of it was just great too. So it was so funny, the coincidence of it, that we just happened to stop the exact place where the Ohio Bigfoot Conference is held.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's a great lodge, a great state park, really beautiful. And that's a very fun place to be.
Yeah, because I might have had something happen to me, like, because obviously, of course, when we were there, and I'm like, well, I got to do a little bit of squatching while I'm here a little bit. So we parked in this little area. I got my therm out, turn all the lights off. I'm just looking around, and I don't know exactly what it was. Some sort of sound or something. Just I really don't know what it was. But when I heard this one little sound, I immediately got like that flight or fight response in me of like chills running up my spine, the hair was standing up on the back of my neck, and I didn't even have the guts to even look through the therm. I immediately kind of just got into my car and then drove off. I don't know what that was before because I've heard Bigfoot before at at BFRO expeditions, so I kind of know what to expect. But whatever this sound or feeling I got scared the crap out of me, and we left that area and went right to the hotel.
Yeah, there's a lot of reports in Salt Fork for sure, historically as well. So it's not a bad place to go out looking.
Yeah, because then the following day before we did leave the forest, we did go to some of the spots around the forest. Nothing happened, didn't hear or see anything, but I can see how things happen there. It's a really beautiful forest, and I'm glad I was able to knock that off my bucket list too because I've always wanted to go there, and after all the times of driving, no, it was great, it was fantastic, and we definitely will be going to the Ohio Bigfoot Conference at some point in the future.
Very cool. Yeah, you'll enjoy it a lot.
Oh yeah, because then sometime in June, there's actually an event in northern New Jersey. Actually, pretty close. Like I think you can actually see Staten Island from where it's being held in this little town. And I went there a few years ago, but I actually found out that Dr. Meldrum is going there this year, and I'm like, well, I definitely got to go this year because he was going to be a Cryptid Con 2 years ago, but unfortunately he was sick from something from something he was at and wasn't able to go. So I'm hoping to take this opportunity to go up there and actually meet him for the first time because that's definitely someone I really want to knock off my bucket list as well.
Oh yeah, he's one of the greats of the field research and the field of Sasquatchery, let's say, both in the field and in the proverbial armchair. I consider him a tremendous asset. I've learned an incredible amount from him. I think if you read my book, if you go to the references, he's the most referenced author in my book. I think he's done. He picked up where a lot of the previous academics might have left off, but then he took that so much further than any other academic has. And I feel very strongly about the contributions of Grover Krantz and of John Bindernagel, but Meldrum obviously has done a tremendous amount of good for this subject, and he's definitely worth any amount of travel to go see.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like I've been obviously been wanting to meet him since probably when I first started being aware of him on Monster Quest back all those years ago, and then later on when I bought his book, Legend Meets Science. So obviously, when I go up and meet him, I'll definitely be bringing my copy of the book with me so he could sign because that would definitely be a highly memorable thing for me to bring with me to go and meet him.
Certainly.
All right, so obviously, because obviously I know who you are, but obviously my listeners may not. So who are you, and what do you do?
Well, I've been involved with the pursuit of the Sasquatch for a long time now. I started interviewing local witnesses and going to places near where I grew up, which was in Northeast Georgia in the Southern Appalachians there. That all started for me in about 2002. And in the beginning, it was just trying to understand what it was that people were seeing, if other people even claimed to have sightings or encounters, because the subject was so new to me at that time. And so I was really amazed to find out that so many residents of the community that I grew up in had sightings, or at least claimed to have sightings and encounters. And I also started doing historical research around that time, trying to find references to the potential existence of these things in Southern Appalachia, especially prior to the year 1900. So a lot of that was going through digital archives, which were kind of limited at that time. You were kind of restricted to things like JSTOR or these other repositories, but then, print media archives as well from either newspapers that had survived or defunct newspapers or different media outlets. And then in 2004, I started going out in the field. Really, that was predicated on, I'd seen a series that Doug Hychek produced. It was the first series that he produced on the subject prior to Monster Quest, which was called Mysterious Encounters. And it featured, it was basically the first version of what became Finding Bigfoot, essentially, because it was based around the BFRO and their research and their database and witnesses that had reached out and filed reports with the BFRO. Matt Moneymaker was in almost every episode, and then Bobo was in several episodes. Rick Knoll, a lot of people that names that Sasquatch researchers would recognize. But it was hosted by a woman named Autumn Williams, who was a great Sasquatch researcher as well. And after I saw that show, they were doing things like night investigations, going out at night and generating sounds and trying to elicit responses or elicit approaches of Sasquatches in hopes of recording the sounds or catching the encounters on video, whether that was with night vision or thermal imagers. And so once I saw that show, I was like, oh, I never thought about trying to do that. I had only been going out to places where, sightings had supposedly occurred, or meeting up with witnesses to see the places and maybe looking for tracks. But then this behavioral approach was introduced, that like maybe you could try to quote unquote make contact with a Sasquatch if one was around, and facilitate an encounter or an experience that way. And so for those first few years, I was just on my own. I'd reached out to other Sasquatch researchers, but at that time in the early 2000s, the bulk of them would have been in the Northwest. And there was a handful in Florida, and then some kind of near you, either like Ohio, Pennsylvania, those regions. But there really wasn't anyone established online in the Southeast, so there was no one I could really make contact with. And I was very young at the time. I was in my early 20s, and so being basically like a kid in the eyes of a lot of these people, and in the Southeast, like they just, not many people were very interested in responding to me. So I was on my own for a long time, and then eventually made contact with people who were in the process of joining the BFRO, as the BFRO was building out a Southeastern chapter of researchers and investigators. And so I got involved with the BFRO in 2007. It was when I officially became a member, and then started attending expeditions of theirs, and then eventually organizing expeditions. And as that continued to grow, my field research expanded to other regions of the Southeast. And then I eventually moved to the Pacific Northwest to pursue Sasquatch research there. And that's where I met Cliff, eventually met Bobo. And so over the years, I've, continued to pursue it all over the country. But then the number of tasks I've sort of taken on or been a part of, from being a BFRO investigator to an expedition organizer to being a field coordinator and fixer for finding Bigfoot when that series was created. And I eventually joined a group called the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, and was the field teams manager there, and then sat on the board of directors for a while, and co-produced and co-hosted their podcast, and then started to co-host, well, semi-co-host, and then produce and edit a podcast for Cliff and Bobo in 2019. Wrote and released a book in 2023. So I've worn a lot of hats over the last 20 years of pursuing this, and that just continues to expand, thankfully.
Well, gosh, like, man, you really have done so much, and obviously I'm also really appreciative that you were able to take your time today to be here.
Well, I'm glad to finally get to chat with you. Sorry it's been so hectic and busy lately, but I'm glad we both had the time today, and appreciate
No, of course, like I completely understand. You're a very busy guy, and the fact I'm able to get any sort of time with you at all, I'm going to cherish that immensely. So I'm definitely going to do as much as we can with the time that we got. So obviously you kind of mentioned a little bit what you did when you started doing Finding Bigfoot, but how did you like how did you get involved with the show itself? Like, were you one of people that like got off the ground, or they got you in later? Like, how did you just get involved with the show?
Well, interestingly, Matt had been trying to put together a TV series for a number of years. And one of the things that always really impressed me about Matt Moneymaker was that there were several opportunities that came along that he had the foresight and the sort of strength of will to realize, like, this is not the right opportunity. So I remember there were offers that had come along that he'd eventually say no to, and he would very often like forward the emails either to all of the BFRO investigators or to myself and a handful of others, so to kind of keep us abreast of what was going on in terms of these different production companies and their interest. But he could sort of tell when something wasn't going in a direction that would be good for the subject or good for the organization, if it was something more sensationalistic or outlandish. And so that had been going on for a few years. And then Matt had worked with one of these potential producers, and they were interested in shooting essentially like a sizzle reel. It wasn't quite a pilot because it wasn't a pilot episode for a greenlit thing, but we did film something on an island called Harstein Island in the Puget Sound of Washington. And on that trip, it was like Matt Moneymaker, Wally Hersom, myself, Derek Randalls, and a handful of other BFRO investigators at that time. There was a house there that had experienced repeated visitations or ongoing activity, and the occupants of that house had left, and so we had access to the house. So we went and stayed there for a week with this small production crew, basically a couple of producers and a camera person, and filmed during that time. And then that ended up that was one of the ones that Matt thought, I don't know if these are the right people to work with for this particular thing. And then Matt hired his own sort of production folks, one of which was the same camera guy. And we filmed um, an expedition that I was on that I actually led in central Georgia. I think I have the order backwards. I think we filmed the central Georgia sizzle reel first. And this camera guy, a super cool guy from Pennsylvania named Jason, was there, and then he was also there later at Harstein Island, which was probably like 6 or 8 months later. So I'd been involved in a couple of these filmings for a potential, you know, series that just never came to be. So when the Animal Planet thing finally happened, and they put together the series, initially a pilot was greenlit, and so Matt, Cliff, Bobo, and Renee went to Alaska and filmed the pilot episode, some of which you see in that Alaska episode of the first season, and then some of which they went back and filmed additional scenes. So that Alaska episode in season 1 is sort of a hybrid of the original pilot that was filmed in 2010, and then some additional filming that happened in 2011. But once the pilot was picked up and they knew this was going to be a series and they greenlit a season, Matt had reached out to the BFRO investigators and said, like, what locations should we go to? Can you put together some almost like info packets, like pitches for a location? And so, a number of BFRO members did, and I put together one for Northeast Georgia, specifically around my hometown of Helen, Georgia, of things that I had investigated over the years and things that came directly to me, which included, some tracks that had been recently found, a number of witnesses that I knew and had spent time with and interviewed extensively, the Georgia dash cam video, which was filmed by a guy that I grew up with, who I knew for many years before he even became a sheriff's deputy, and had that incident, which was caught on camera, that the episode was about. So I turned that in, and that was one of the first to be greenlit. The production company said, well, okay, we're definitely going to make this an episode. And I had really no experience in television. The only thing I'd done remotely like that before is I had a multi-day production assistant gig on the first season of the show Rockstar, which was that first season they were trying to find a replacement singer for the deceased Michael Hutchence for the band INXS. And I had some friends who hooked me up with a PA gig for a few days when they filmed part of a season in Atlanta. And so that didn't really count towards this. So I just had no experience, and I had no like aspirations of working on the show. But when they were putting all this together, it was Matt and Cliff and Bobo primarily who had told the production company, well, look, when we go to Georgia, we're going to have to get permits to film on all these public lands. We're going to have access to all these witnesses. We're going to have to know which, places to stay in, where to rent cars. And they said, Pruitt knows all this stuff because that's where he's from and he does all this stuff. And they convinced the production company to hire me as the field coordinator and fixer, because everything that they had greenlit the episode to be about was from me. And, those guys had never met all the witnesses or been to any of the locations. They actually offered me the gig, and I took it, which was pretty amazing for, someone having like no experience there. And the way that those episodes would work is there'd be an advanced producer who would come to the location for a week, for the week prior to the filming, just to get the lay of the land and to secure everything that needed to be secured. And so the advanced producer on that episode was named Natalie, and she was very, very good at her job. And so, she and I set up everything and worked well together. And then the team came in and we filmed for 7 days, and it went really, really well. And that episode, I think, impressed the network enough. We found tracks during that episode that my good friend Tyler Bounds actually found, and brought Cliff and Renee too. I was there when all that occurred. So that when the next round of filmings came around, by that point I was living in Oklahoma City at the time. And Chad Hamill, the showrunner, had reached out to me and said, hey, that worked out really well with you last time. I don't know if you have any locations in mind or if there's anything near you now. And so I put together the same sort of info packet for Central Oklahoma and said, yeah, here's what I've got. Here are the witnesses I know. Here are the locations I think are viable. And they greenlit that and hired me again to do the same job again. And so that ended up being an episode called CSI Bigfoot, which was part of season 3 of the show. And so I feel really fortunate to have gotten to do that twice. And I helped out with some other episodes. Sometimes PAs would reach out and say, "Hey, we're looking into witnesses. Like, do you have any suggestions for this location, or do you mind calling some of these witnesses for us?" Or, I'd go meet up with them when they were filming in other places, but not necessarily working on the episode. Like, I saw some of that stuff in Indiana. I went out there and then was part of a couple episodes that they did in Tennessee, one in East Tennessee and then one in Middle Tennessee. So that was always cool to be a part of that. But that's basically how that happened.
Wow. I mean, it sounds like you're pretty much involved with it since like the very beginning, even before they officially hired you for it. That's pretty crazy that in some form and way you were kind of involved with it like throughout the entire time.
Yeah, and it was just amazing to see all that unfold because, I grew up playing music professionally. And so I saw so many people have these brushes with what seemed to be like golden opportunities that just never came to fruition because that's just kind of the nature of the entertainment industry. I was in a band that was signed to a major label that had a huge record deal. Um, and they were one of my favorite bands. And then I ended up getting asked to join that band after their first album had been released, which was pretty successful. And then our second album never got released, and we made it like 2.5 times with different producers and all this stuff. And then I'd seen just over and over again things like that happen with friends of mine in bands. And so after years of that, you just kind of think, well, you should never expect that something's going to actually work out just because faces change in those industries so quickly. Like you might get signed to a deal with some production company and they love you and everything about you. And then the people that signed the deal, they leave that company. And so the company inherits you, but they don't really know what to do with you. And they have their own projects they're working on. So after seeing the first few iterations and like sizzle reels and things happening, it's like, oh, okay, this is kind of like the record label industry used to be, is that, who knows if anything will happen. And then when they filmed that pilot, it was sort of like, well, we'll see if anything happens. And then the first season got greenlit. Oh, that's really cool. Well, we'll see if they get a second season. And so to see the trajectory of success of that show, like I know just how insanely rare that is because, most things never go to pilot. Like most things that are pitched are never developed, and then most things that are picked up and made into pilots are never developed into seasons. And then even if a season gets shot, most of them don't get renewed for another season. And so the planets aligning in a way to make all those sort of nearly impossible things happen for Matt and Cliff and Bobo and Renee to have so many successful seasons and 100 plus episodes over all those years was like just an amazing thing to see and watch. And it became like real for me right after that first season because I was working in this professional, it was like a pro bike shop in Oklahoma City. We catered to like, um, whether they were like racing cyclists or triathletes or just a host of different people in that world, or even like pro mountain bikers. And so, I was not a bike dude. I just had a lot of like retail and retail management experience, but I would wear my BFRO t-shirt to work. And I'd been in the BFRO at that time for many years, and no one knew what it was. No one had ever asked me about it. It was just one of the few T-shirts I had, And that show had been on for like I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 episodes. And I'm working in the shop, and these people come in. They're like, "Oh my God, BFRO! Do you watch that TV show? We love that show." And I was like, "Oh, it's getting interesting. Like people are watching this. Like the general public. It's not just other Bigfoot researchers or people who are interested in Bigfoot, but just normal people flipping through the channels and stumbling on it and then deciding like, oh, this is really interesting." And so seeing those kind of things happen and watching that was really exciting. There was another time shortly thereafter that I was in South Carolina assisting as a volunteer with a canoe kayak tour of a cypress swamp. And it was big family groups and things like that. So I was helping out as a volunteer. And we're getting in these canoes and kayaks and going into the swamp. And there's a group of kids in front of me with their parents. And I heard them start saying like, let's do calls. Let's do calls. You do the Bobo call and I'll do the Cliff call. And they're like imitating Cliff and Bobo from Finding Bigfoot. And it's just a reminder, oh man, this is really big with the general public to where like kids are imitating it out in the woods, hoping the Sasquatch shows up. So it was so awesome to see all that.
That's funny. That's really funny. Like I can't imagine how that must have felt. Like, oh, you filmed a thing, and then even though the show just started, it's then all of a sudden like hitting, like kicking you of like it's like, oh dang, like people are actually like this is this is really a thing. Because I remember when I first saw the commercial for it that summer, and I was watching, and I'm like, oh my god, a Bigfoot show. Because it's been a little bit since Monster Quest ended, and I loved Monster Quest. Monster Quest was one of my pretty much when I started learning about a lot more about the more cryptids and all the Bigfoot things and everything like that. So when I was starting to watch it, I was like, "This is awesome! This is awesome!" Of course, I learned the truth about the first couple episodes of the first season and stuff like that, and the whole situation with the horse and everything. But and then and then that year when I went to New York Comic Con with my cousin and they were all there, that's when I first met them and I was like, oh my god, there they are. And then that's when I found out from Bobo that I was actually the first real fan of the show they actually just met, because the show only just recently came out, and I guess they obviously haven't done probably any real public events yet. But yeah, I found that later on. It's like, yeah, Mike, you were like the first real fan of the show we ever met. So I'm kind of glad I can kind of hold on to that title a little bit of the very first fan that to them, and I'm pretty happy about that.
Oh, you should be. Absolutely. It was such a cool thing to see. And the rapid rise of popularity of that show, because obviously when we filmed the first season, there's no show yet. So no one knows what the hell's going on. So we filmed that in my hometown and like trying to get together a town hall meeting. I put flyers up everywhere and like no strangers showed up. So I had to like populate that whole crowd with the existing witnesses that I knew and other friends of mine who had heard stories just so we'd have enough people there on camera just to look like a bunch of people showed up. And then when I did that Oklahoma episode, season one had aired. I think season two was starting to roll out, but it hadn't fully rolled out yet. And so they're filming season three as season two was rolling out. And by that point, like I go to pick them up at Will Rogers Airport in Oklahoma. And as soon as Bobo walks off the plane, people in the terminals are yelling at him, "Oh my God, Bobo!" and wanting to take pictures and get autographs. And then, we'd go to the bar by the hotel and people would freak out. "Oh my God, Bobo, what are you doing here?" And just like total admiration and excitement that he was there. And then we went down to Bricktown for the rap party once the shoot was over. And I remember we parked in this parking garage and we were going across the street. And as soon as Bobo emerges from the parking garage onto the street, a car slams on its brakes and comes to a complete stop in the street. And the window rolls down. And this guy's like, "Oh my God, Bobo, what are you doing here?" And by that point, it's like, "Hey, we're doing this town hall meeting," and there's like way more people showing up than the room can even fit. And that was just like we filmed that Helen, Georgia episode in like February of 2011, and we filmed that Oklahoma episode in February of 2012. So just in like a year's time to go from 0 to 1,000, it seemed like watching that happen, especially because I first met Bobo in 2009, but we didn't really like interact on any sort of like deep or personal level, just introductions and small talk. And then in 2010, we filmed an episode of a TV series that Bob Saget hosted. And I was there, Moneymaker and Derek Randalls and Bart Catino, a whole lot of people. But that's where I really got to know Bobo and Cliff. Um, and so, we had been friends for like a year at that point, or 2 years by the time the Oklahoma thing rolled around. So to see like your friends getting like recognized in public and people freaking out, it was like, it always made me emotional. It still kind of does. Like even just a couple of years ago, when the first Smoky Mountain Bigfoot conference happened, I spoke there and Cliff spoke there. And we went a day early. My wife and I met up with Cliff, and we are just walking around the streets of Gatlinburg, and like people were coming up to Cliff and freaking out, like, "Oh my God, what are you doing here in town?" And like my wife and I were getting like teary eyed watching it, just because it's like it's so cool to see that what they were doing just by pursuing what they love to do matters to people. And I've seen that over and over again. We were in Ohio last year, and a woman came up to Cliff's table and was saying like, "Hey, I had some really rough years there in my life personally, and like one of my favorite escapes that would take my mind off of all that was watching Finding Bigfoot every night." And so you kept me a lot of company through some dark times. And like Emily and I cried as this person's still there. And Cliff got teary eyed, you know, and it's like,
Aw.
it's amazing when you see that, like, it matters to so many people and complete strangers. And so I feel super grateful to play like a tiny little part in that. But more than anything, I'm just grateful to see that love come back to, especially Cliff and Bobo. I mean, I'm friends with all four of them, but you know, Cliff and Bobo are like brothers to me. So to see people like celebrate their pursuits is just a beautiful thing.
Yeah, honestly, because I remember when, like, I was a nervous wreck when I first met Renee and Bobo the first time, because I was asking my question, I was like so jittery and everything else like that, and I asked my question, and then afterwards, when I was walking up the aisle, Renee actually put her arm around me. It's like, you know, that was a really good question, man. You know, we're walking up there, I get a picture with her. And then after that, she's like, "You said you really like Bobo, right?" It's like, "Hold on, let me go get him for you." So she literally goes, gets Bobo for me, and I get a picture with the both of them. It's not until 2 years later in 2013 that I officially actually met Matt and Cliff personally,
Mm-hmm.
and that was also the episode that they were actually at New York Comic Con, and I'm on there and I'm on Team Bobo, so you actually see me on TV on that special episode in New York Comic Con for a little bit, and that was a big crowning achievement for me when that episode first aired and it first online. I'm like, oh my god! It's like 11 o'clock at night, and my mom comes running. And it's like, whoa, what's wrong? I'm on TV. And it's like all right, cool, be quiet. No, I can't be quiet. I'm on TV right now, kind of thing. So I was really excited when that happened, and like I was always interested in the topic of Bigfoot and, you know, some basic cryptozoology like aliens and Nessie, but it wasn't until finding Bigfoot that the real love and appreciation for Bigfoot just skyrocketed. Like it was from like, okay, to being like, I need this to be part of my life now. And ever since then, like whenever I watch the show, I didn't have my phone within anywhere of arm's length. I would throw it away. I would have my bowl of ice cream and I would just watch every episode. I would only touch my phone. It was on commercial, but as soon as the show came back on, I throw my phone to the side and it's like, I'm fully glued and invested onto this. That's how much of a like a life improvement finding Bigfoot was for me. And if it wasn't probably because of that, I probably even wouldn't be doing my podcast or anything else like that. So the amount of love and appreciation I personally have for finding Bigfoot is I can't even fully even say in words because on how much it means to me.
Oh, that's so cool to hear. Now, how old were you when you first met Bobo and Renee at that very first meeting?
All right, so let's see. So when I first that was 2011. I actually just graduated high school,
Very
and
cool.
my cousin got me tickets, got me weekend passes, actually full 4 day passes for New York Comic Con. So, uh, I think I would have been 19
Very cool.
when I
That's
first met
awesome,
them.
man.
I know it's like, and it was such an amazing day, and then when I met them again in 2013, I did the same thing I did the first time. I actually went alone, but I got in the back of the line of the panel before the Finding Bigfoot one. So I literally waited the entire panel beforehand, front in line, waiting for that panel to start. And as I'm sitting there, people are lining up behind me. I noticed, I noticed, they're starting to pop up. There's Renee, they're starting to pop up, and I'm sitting there. I see Renee looking at me, kind of tilting her head, and I kind of read her lips, going, "Michael," and she walks over to me, gives me a big old hug. It's like, "Oh, Michael, it's so good to see you again." Everything else like that, and that's also when the Finding Bigfoot book came out that I bought from Cliff earlier in the day. So I got her to sign it. He's like, "Here, do you want Bobo and Matt to sign it?" I'm like, yeah. I asked the people about the mother and son behind me. They'd hold my place in line for a moment. It's like, "Yeah, go ahead, go ahead." They were both amazed that she even knew who I was. So I went up there. I officially met Matt for the first time, and then Bobo was like, "Hey, Mike, good to see you," because I think I got in some sort of like Facebook connection with him after that and everything. And so go along. I go back in line. I wait. Panel goes on. That's when they start getting like, all right, who wants to be on whose team? I raised my hand, and of course I got picked for Bobo's team, and it was me and this little kid. And I remember that before I went and did my howl, Bo was like, "Oh yeah, everyone, by the way, this is Mike Madden. He's our number one biggest fan. We saw him last time we were here, so everyone give you your utmost attention." So I did my how, and everyone cheers, and he raises my hand in the air and everything, and that was just a fantastic day. And at the very end, before I left, I guess they had like an assistant with them for either from like Animal Planet or just for the convention in general. But she pulls me aside. She's like, "Don't leave. I got something for you." I'm like, "Okay." So like I stand there a little bit, and apparently, like a lot of panels, they always have those big boards that for like this panel now has these people here. She went around and got all of them to sign the poster for me and hand it to me. He's like, "Here you go." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." So I started getting a little teary, and Bobo was like, "Yes, we made him cry." so, so so I said thank you to everyone like that, and I went home. And next thing you know, I go to meet my cousin at the restaurant she's working at, and she just sees me walking in with all the stuff. She's like, "Oh my god, Mike, tell me what just happened." And then I told her.
Man, that's so super cool, and that's awesome that they went so far out of their way to, especially whoever the assistant was, because that's a such a generous thing, and it those kind of things, as obviously so fresh in your memory, it's like people remember those acts of kindness for their whole lives, and so I'm very glad to hear that went so well. That's awesome.
Oh yeah, it was fantastic. They had that episode on YouTube up for like a while, and I would always try to favorite it, but then the episode would always be taken down, and I'm like, all right, you know what? Screw it. I'm just gonna go and buy the episode. Well, unfortunately, I couldn't buy just the episode. I had to buy the entire season, well, which was fine because I think it was like I don't know, like 10, $11 for me to buy the whole season. So now I can actually go on my YouTube account and actually, watch my crowning moments. Because besides my initial how, you do see Bobo signing my book, and and a few times of me popping up of me like they they unfortunately on camera they got me holding my heart because I was so goddamn nervous that my heart was like going like boom 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 boom. I'm like, oh my god, oh my god. And one of the camera guys got me with that. I'm like, oh come on. But the initial hell itself went really really well, and then it was a fantastic day for me, and just I had no words on how well that day went.
That is awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. I didn't know all that backstory, so that's super cool.
Yeah, it really was. Yeah, it was one of the days I'm gonna hold like in my heart for like the rest of my days, just in how great it was.
Absolutely.
So, what's some personal activity that you've had, like maybe also including if you've ever seen one, but what's an activity or so that you personally have had that have been the most memorable and just like amazing for you?
Oh, there's been quite a few, honestly, going back all these years. I mean, I can't tell you how many hundreds and hundreds of days and nights I've spent in the field pursuing encounters, trying to have an encounter, trying to see one. I've never had a sighting. Now two of those encounters did have a visual component, um, but I wouldn't count either of them as a sighting. The first one was in May of 2007 in central North Carolina, in the Uaris, like very close to where Mike Green eventually got his thermal footage in 2009. This was 2 years prior to that, which was basically, a good bit of activity, some very compelling impressions, but all that I saw of the thing was like a dark silhouette. So I certainly wouldn't count that as a sighting because at the time, in that initial moment, we weren't certain what we were looking at. And then the second time was in northwestern Arkansas in early 2012, and that was just a partial view of something through a thermal imager. So I can't say I've had a sighting where like I was looking at one and I could tell you that I knew what I was seeing. But in terms of like memorable encounters, there's been quite a few. The ones that come to mind, funnily enough, um, that I think about the most often were all the result of like absolute dumb luck, right place, right time. Like there was one that happened in North Georgia in an area I'd already been working pretty hard for a few years at that point, and where I'd taken a lot of sighting reports. It's very close to where we filmed one of the night investigations in that Finding Bigfoot episode. Towards the end, there's a scene where we do this big caravan with thermal imagers mounted on the roofs of the vehicles. And so the encounter I had was 5 years prior to that, but like within half a mile of where we did that caravan. Um, to make a very long story short, I was living in Atlanta at the time, and I was up in North Georgia visiting. And a friend of mine's little brother and his friend were like, "Oh, I can't believe you believe in this Bigfoot crap, and there's no such thing," and yada yada. And another friend of mine who'd been out in the field with me a lot, we were all together, and I thought, let's just take them out in the mountains, and we'll just do some stuff at night. Nothing's going to happen because it almost never does, but I know that these dudes never leave the basement and turn off the video games, and so we'll just take them out in the mountains in the dark and scare the hell out of them, and that'll be fun enough. And so we went out. They finally agreed, and so all I had was like a headlamp, and I grabbed a baseball bat out of my buddy's garage so I could do some wood knocks with it, and just had no expectations. And the first spot we drove to, there was a little high point that overlooked a creek drainage, sort of halfway up this mountain. So, like, you get up to this high point, and like down to one side of you, it slopes down to the creek bottom, like within a couple of miles. It's probably not even that far. It's probably within like a mile of the headwaters of this creek that eventually drains into the Chattahoochee River. And then on the other side of the road, it slopes up to the top of this mountain. So we parked and then walked up to this high point, and it was well after dark. It's probably already like midnight or 1 a.m. or something like that at this time. And the two skeptic guys were already really nervous. They're like, we didn't know there was anything like this around here, because they didn't camp, they didn't hike, they didn't go out in the mountains around our hometown at all. And we walk up to this point, and I had the baseball bat, and I did 3 knocks, and I was going to just sit there and listen, and just, again, thinking like, well, nothing's going to happen, so there's nothing really to think about. And so I did these knocks, and I crossed my arms with the bat still in one hand. And no sooner had I crossed my arms to stand still and listen, that down the slope towards the creek, there was a big bellowing, moaning howl, sort of like what people refer to as the Ohio howl, because that's one of the best recorded examples of it is Matt Moneymaker's 1994 Ohio howl recording.
Oh yeah, I love that one.
And as that howl is resonating from down below us from the creek, to our other side, up the slope, up the mountain, comes a second howl. Same sound, big bellowing moan howl, and they're overlapping each other, like howling to each other. And it was jarring. I was just kind of frozen and slack-jawed, like, oh my God. And after the howl stopped, my friends are like, what the hell was that? And I'm like, dude, what do you think that was? Those weren't coyotes, and those aren't people, man. Like, that's what we're here for. Like, we just stumbled in between 2 of them. And I think because we didn't drive to that exact point, we just managed to kind of sneak in. And they probably heard, speculating obviously, but, my interpretation was like, well, they heard those knocks and were like, hey, Bill, was that you? No, John, that wasn't me. Was that you? That kind of thing. And so we're listening, and then we hear like marching in the vegetation from both sides. Like the one downhill from the creek is making its way up, and the one up the hill is making its way down. And they get to a certain point, and it just stops, and it goes dead quiet. And we're just standing there frozen, and it's quiet for 20, 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity as we're waiting for something to happen. And one of them asked me like, oh my God, did they leave? And I said, no, I think they could probably see us. Like, I think they got to a certain point where they could, all of a sudden they see 4 dudes standing in this Forest Service road, because we were out in the open in this road. And it was just dead still, dead quiet. And these guys started getting real nervous at that point, and they were like, we should go. And I'm like, no, man, like, you don't understand. This never happens. Like, this is exactly why we're out here. We cannot leave. They're getting real scared. And so I said, okay, well, we'll walk back down to the car if that'll make you feel better, but we're not going to leave. Like, we can get in the car, but we're going to keep the windows down and listen. And they're like, yeah, please, please, please. So we walk back down to the vehicle. We're sitting there, and I roll the windows down. We're just listening in the quiet, and it's quiet for a long time. And then at one point, we heard knocks from down the downslope side, like big, powerful knocks. And then there was the sound of something like coming through all the leaves and then landing in the road, like tick, 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 kaboom. Like something had been hurled from that downslope side, flown up through the canopy, or at least through the vegetation, and then landed on the road. So I turned on like the running lights of the vehicle, and sure enough, there's this rock, maybe softball size, baseball to softball size, in the road, near the vehicle, and there's dust coming up from around it, being illuminated by the vehicle lights where it had just landed and kicked up dust on the road. I was like, dude, something threw that. Like, are you guys convinced now? Like something knocked back and something threw a rock. And it was quiet for quite a long time. It's probably minutes, but it felt like much longer when you're in that heightened state and you're kind of on edge. And they kept wanting to leave. And after it had been quiet for a few minutes, I thought, okay, well, maybe they've left. You know, they realize we're people. We're sitting in a car now. Like maybe it's all over. We're just done here. And so I eventually was like, okay, well, we'll move on. So I cranked the car. We started driving. And where I was, I couldn't turn around where I was. I needed to drive up a ways to get to the next place where I could turn around. So I'm going in the direction that we had walked and that the stuff had first started. And as I'm driving, we're still in the car talking, but the windows are down. And we heard what sounded kind of like a whoop again from that downhill side. And I just barely heard it because we were talking and the vehicle's running and we're driving. And I was like, did you guys hear that? And they're like, yeah, I heard something. So I stopped right then and there, turned off the car to kill all the sound. And I was like, to my friend who was in the passenger seat, I said, make that same sound back out the window at it. Let's see if we can get it to respond. So he whoops out the window. It's quiet. Nothing happened. And so after a few minutes, like, okay, well, maybe we didn't hear, I don't know, or maybe they're gone or whatever the case may be. So I crank the car again. It's actually before I crank the car, like I flip on the headlights and I'm going to crank the car. And on the upslope side, the uphill side, which is like very close by, this huge, powerful scream came. Big, loud, very high pitched, not like a bellowing howl, but like a high pitched, like a giant woman screaming at the top of her lungs. And I remember it was so loud and so close that I had this immediate involuntary, like physiological response. And what I remember the most about it is like it felt like you put your face very close to a campfire. Like my whole face just felt like it was on fire. Like all the nerve endings just came alive because it was so jarring and frightening and bam, out of nowhere. So I immediately like turn off the lights and I'm sitting there like, oh my God, oh my God. And my friend's little brother is behind me in the rear seat and he starts punching the headrest of my driver's seat, punching it over, going, go, 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 go. And I was like, shut up, shut up, shut up. Like, be quiet, man. Like we might hear that again. Just be quiet, be cool. Let's see if it makes that sound again. And then I heard him start crying. And I can hear the sound in my mind like it was yesterday. He said, I don't ever want to hear that sound ever again. And he was crying. And so we sat there for just a couple minutes, but it was quiet. So I turn on the lights, crank the car, and I look where the lights are illuminating, and there's one tree that's sort of got a strange bend in it. Like the way it had grown. There was kind of a crook in the trunk, like a smaller tree. I don't know, maybe like 10 inches in diameter. So I was like, okay, that's a very visually identifiable tree. I can come straight back to this spot tomorrow in daylight and start looking upslope from that tree because that whatever made that sound was somewhere upslope from there. And so I can come back and look for tracks. So I'm okay with leaving now because now I have a starting point for tomorrow. So I drove them back and they're all shaken up. And me and my buddy are super excited because he had been out with me many times before and nothing had ever happened. You know, it was always dead quiet.
Yeah.
And so that next day I told my friend's little brother, like, hey, let's go. I'm going to go look for tracks. Come with me. And he was like, I'm not going back there. I am not going back there. And I was like, dude, it's a bright, beautiful, sunny day. What are you worried about? Like there's nothing's going to get us, you know, you can see, you know, and he would not go. And it got to the point that later I ran into his mom and she had said, she's like, that's not funny what you did to him that night. And I said, oh, I didn't do anything. Like that was not a prank. I didn't set that up. Like that actually happened. And she said, he won't even camp on our property anymore because they had this big horse farm and like lots and lots of property and a lot of wooded property and, you know, a couple ponds and streams and all that stuff. And it freaked him out that badly. And then years later, I talked to his dad and he told me kind of the same thing. He said, you know, that really shook him up that night. And then when I finally asked him about it years later, he had said, I have no doubt that Sasquatches exist because he said, have we heard them that night? And so there's been a few encounters over the years that have been like that, where I've gone out and planned and pored over maps and strategically selected locations for weeks or months and then planned these long, week long expeditions and nothing happens. And then there's other times where it's like, hey, I'm going to turn down this road. I've never been down here before. And then I get out and like, oh, maybe we should do a call or two and just see. And then boom, we have activity. And so there really is nothing that you can do about when you have an animal that seems to have a really large home range and that moves around an awful lot within that home range, like a highly mobile animal. Even if you knew the specific boundaries of that individual's range or territory, if it's many, many square miles, you don't know where it is inside there. And so you will always have to rely on some degree of luck of just being like accidentally close to one that it's in earshot. So when you make those sounds, they respond or they come and investigate. So that's happened to me a handful of times, but 3 times in particular that come to mind where it was just like right place, right time, dumb luck. There was one time in Washington in 2010 where it's a similar kind of situation where Tyler Bounds and I took out 4 friends of ours who were all 4 skeptics, and they all 4 saw 2 of them, and Tyler and I missed it. Tyler and I were looking in the wrong direction,
Ah.
and so but it was again just right place, right time, dumb luck.
I mean, that is the name of the game, isn't it? Like you can do all the research in the world you can to, all right, they are going to be here around this time of the year. We're going to get them, and then all you get is crickets. But then you like, you know what? I'm just going to walk down this road and just see what happens. And just this is a lovely day. And then lo and behold, you get like a wood knock or or a howl, and I'm like, the hell? What are you doing here? Why aren't you in the place where I was looking for you and stuff like that? So obviously you can never truly know if anything's ever going to happen. And anyone who's interested in getting into the subject and everything obviously has to know that something's not going to happen every single time. It's just a matter of luck. It really is.
Oh, it is, and there's times that I've had a number of encounters over the years, and if I laid them all out sequentially, it might seem like a pretty big handful or double handful, but then to explain to people like, no, man, this is after hundreds and hundreds of days and nights over many, many years of trying. Like really going out in the field and trying started for me in 2004. So it's been over like 20 years of going out in the field a lot. And the frequency is so low when things happen because you really have to be close. I mean, you could be within half a mile or a mile of one and not know it, and it not hear you and you not hear it. So for you to have an observation or experience, you have to be pretty close. And so even if, again, where its boundaries are and the range that it occupies and stays in most of the time, you still have to be like exactly where it is at a given point. The only way around that is like if you know the right place, because you have to be in the right place at the right time. If you know roughly the right place, you have to be there as close to all the time as possible. And that's the only
Mm-hmm.
way that those odds increase. It's like you find a good spot and you spend as much time there as possible. And it's a hard lesson to learn because I'm a pretty kinetic and exploratory person. And so I always want to see something I've never seen before or go somewhere I've never been. And that's an urge as I get older. I always have to like try not to give into. Because if there's anything I would go back in time and change, I would have spent more time in the same places. Like for example, I spent a whole year doing an extended field research project where that's all I did full time. I spent over 200 days and nights in the field in a single year trying to get footage. And, there was some pressure because there was an expectation. It was being sponsored. So I was getting the funding to facilitate that and had equipment provided. So I felt a lot of this pressure of like, okay, well now there's expectation and, this is an opportunity that'll probably never happen again. I need to make the most of it. And so I'd have activity in a place, or I'd go to a place where I'd had activity previously. And after, 3, 4, 5 nights there, nothing happening, I would let that, oh my God, I'm in the wrong place. I need to go to another place. I'm wasting my time. What am I doing here? The sand's falling through the hourglass. I've got to make the most of this opportunity. And I would go somewhere new. And when I look back on that year, it's like I went to so many different places. And I literally only had like 3 interesting nights out of that whole 200 days and nights in the field. Um, And I probably went to like, I don't know, 20 something, 30 locations, something like that. Whereas I should have said, no, just keep going back to the same spot. If it's quiet for a few days, that doesn't mean it's time to leave. That means like maybe tonight's the night. Like maybe they're around and they'll be coming closer or whatever the case may be. And so it's a hard lesson to learn because it's exciting to go somewhere new. And you always think like, if you're digging for buried treasure and you hadn't hit it yet, that, oh, I'm digging in the wrong spot, where it's like, well, maybe if you just dug 6 inches deeper, you'd find it, So it's,
Exactly. There's a little meme I've seen of that, of like two guys digging for looking for diamonds,
yep.
and the one guy keeps digging and he stops. But if he just kept, and there's another guy who keeps digging just a few more feet and would reach a mother lode right there. So of course, I fully understand how all that works.
Yep. And so that's the big takeaway. So that's what I try to do these days is just keep going back to my favorite places, the places where I've experienced activity or that have produced a lot of reports or both, and that I have the most familiarity with. And like, no matter what, just keep recommitting to those spots. And I've gone as long as like 4 years without having heard anything. I mean, there was a stretch of time between like probably 2013 and 2017 where I didn't hear it. I had nothing happen despite being out in the field a lot. And so
Wow.
these stretches of time can be very long. So it's certainly not like I have activity every time or every other time or every 5 times and not even every 10 or 20 times. Like sometimes there's long stretches.
Oh yeah.
I mean, there's years I've spent in Area X where for a whole year didn't have anything happen, and I might have gone down to the valley like 5 or 6 times that year, 3 of which were week long excursions. So that alone is like 21 days in the field with nothing to do except look for Sasquatches day and night for a week straight. Like no taking breaks to do other stuff. Like that's all we're there to do. And then other times I've been down there, we've had a lot of activity. And so it really is like you just got to be in the right place as close to all the time as possible.
Wow. Yeah. I consider myself extremely lucky that I had the interactions and the sightings, the things I heard on my BFRO expedition, because I know obviously again, even the BFRO, they can do the best they can. They can go to an area that probably has multitude of reports, but if they're just not there during the time that you are, you know that's just how it is. It's the name of the game pretty much. And I'm just incredibly lucky that I had the experiences that I had there, of hearing my first Bigfoot for the first time, one throwing a rock at me, and one even doing like a little wood knock grunt at me because I think I got a little too close to it when we were doing some little wood knocks in this one area. So I consider myself extremely lucky that I had what I did during that time during the BFRO expedition, where people can go and have nothing at all.
Yeah, there's one of the big strengths of doing the expedition style thing because I've attended so many of those, and then I was the organizer for 10 public expeditions and then a lot of private ones. But then the other public expeditions that I attended were another like 10 or 12. So I've been on 20 something BFRO expeditions, and the biggest strength of that is like you're in a good area, but if you've got like 20 to 30 people, you can cast a very wide net over that area because you can split everyone into teams of three. And let's say you have 30 people. Well, now you've got 10 teams of three. So you might have a central base camp. But if there's 10 different, ridges and drainages and little creek canyons around you, you can send a team to each one of those simultaneously every night. And so rather than like if it's me and two of my best field partners, we can only work one spot at a time. And those are constrained by the topography. So if we choose like we're going to go up this creek canyon and look for sign and make sounds, if there's not one in that terrain feature, like we're just out of luck. But if you've got enough of those teams and then you reconvene at camp at the end of the night and you're like, who heard what where? And it's like 9 out of the 10 teams struck out, but this one team up this one drainage had an exchange of wood knocks or vocalizations or whatever. Well, it's like, okay, now we know where to start focusing versus, if it was just me and a few people, like most of the places I go, like, yeah, we have a base camp, but if you set, even 10 square miles around there, 5 square, whatever the case may be, like it would take nearly a lifetime for you as a single individual to like walk every inch of that and look for sign and really pick over everything. And versus if you can cast that big wide net with a lot of people where, even though there's 30 people in camp, when you go out, it's just 3 people at a time in these little pockets, these landforms and terrain features. And that helps the time crunch a lot in that you can narrow down pretty quickly. Um, if you're there for, Wednesday through Sunday or Thursday through Sunday, the first night or two, usually if you cast the net the right way, someone will have heard something. And then you can start focusing in on like, where in this potential range is the best place for us to be. And there's a big advantage to that for sure. It's kind of like, if you got a lake that you're fishing, well, you as a single fisherman, like you might know where all the best holes are, and you can go to one hole a day and fish and see what happens. Or if you had 30 fishermen and like you got 2 people casting lines in every single of the best fishing holes all day, every day, somebody's going to catch a fish, right? So
Yeah. But yeah, so yeah, it was I consider myself really fortunate during that and everything. But yeah, just it was just overall just a good time and everything with that. And I recommend anyone who's listening, if you get a chance going on a BFRO expedition, I highly recommend it because I'm signed up for the Pennsylvania one for this year, and so I'm looking forward to going back again to do it.
very cool.
So I obviously know, of course, with being involved with finding Bigfoot and just being involved with Bigfoot just in general, obviously you must have been told hundreds, maybe thousands of stories. But do you have one in particular that's always been like the most like memorable of people you being like people ask me and I just immediately just go towards that one?
Oh, there's so many because I've probably interviewed, I mean, definitely over 2,000 claimants at this point. Now, not all of those are sightings. A lot of those would be people who heard sounds or who found tracks. Um, so if I narrowed it down to just like really good visual sightings, there's just been so many that often come to mind. There was a gentleman that had really interesting close sighting, sort of on the Nevada-California border back in the 1970s, and his stories always stuck with me. The ones from my hometown and the areas where I grew up, those are pretty impactful for me, just because these were people that were embedded in the same community that I grew up in. That either I knew them personally, or if they were older, like I went to school with their kids because their kids were my age, or they were patients of my dad's. My dad was a local doctor; he was a general practitioner, so patients of his that he knew very well, that he would vouch for their veracity or credibility. Those people are pretty impactful because you realize like they don't have an incentive to lie, and they probably even have more of an incentive not to talk about those things. It's one thing to report something anonymously to a website or a podcast or something, but then when it's like people in your local community who know you, you're taking a big risk, because then if they don't believe you, they could spread the word like, hey, so and so is off their rocker. They're claiming they saw something that doesn't exist, or they're lying about something, or they're, you fill in the blank. People accuse people of being like drunk or whatever, but on some kind of substance. But like there was one woman whose kids I went to school with. She was a local business owner. We did feature her in the first episode of Finding Bigfoot. She saw one cross a road that is literally like half a mile from the house I grew up in, where she saw
Wow.
this road crossing happen, where my mom still lives. So I'm down there all the time. So like those woods were the woods I grew up playing in. Like literally when you see that episode, and then the tagline that was put in every episode where Matt says into the radio, like, I do think there's a Sqautch in these woods. We are literally in the woods behind the house I grew up in.
Wow.
Right.
And me and my girlfriend actually just started to rewatch the show because she never watched it. And I was like, oh, this thing. And wow, I had no idea that it was so close to your house.
Yeah, where Matt was standing when he heard those sounds that made him say that, we're probably about a mile and a half from the house I grew up in. But we're on a creek that eventually drains out, and it goes underneath. The road crosses it. There's a big culvert there, and so where this woman saw one cross the road, it was following that creek and then came up and over the road to continue following it, and that's where she encountered it. And that's like half a mile from the house I grew up in, and her sighting was on Thanksgiving Day of 1999, Thanksgiving evening. And my first experience that got me started in all this was like very close by to there in the summer of 99. So for all I know, that might have been the same individual that she saw. But she basically, because she was driving and it was crossing this road, exiting the forest and then following the creek, but it had to come up and over the road to continue following the creek. Because like I said, there's this large culvert that the creek goes through that the road's built on top of. And so she slammed on her brakes and came to a complete stop, and it came to a complete stop. And so she was just feet away from it, and it's fully illuminated in the headlights of her vehicle. So she wasn't seeing it like through brush or vegetation or at a long distance or in the dark. I mean, she saw it head to toe, brightly lit up, no obstructions, and got a very good look at it. And so she was one of the first witnesses that had that good of a look that I ever spoke to. I talked to other people who had sightings at a distance or who found tracks or heard sounds in the local community. But in terms of like close sightings, she was the first person of that category that I met. And the thing that sticks with me the most, and there's a little anecdote about it in the book, was that when she was telling me about the sighting, I was in the throes of like reading everything I could get my hands on and like renting every VHS documentary I can find from the library or whoever, might have some, or the Bigfoot movies at the video store, and reading everything I could online. So I was just like drowning myself in the sea of Sasquatch, trying to answer the questions, and get answers to the fundamental questions and unravel the mystery, at least for myself. And so I was at the spot with her. She's telling me about everything that happened, and my brain was just swimming because this is so exciting. And oh my God, you got to see this thing that I want to see so badly. And I was so excited. I was kind of talking out loud through I was trying to process the event. So I was like, oh, it must have been following this creek, and there's a lot of resources up in here, and where it had come out of is a protected area. So it used to be private land that was all privately held as like a private conservation area. And then when the gentleman who owned it passed away, it was given to the Georgia State Park system. So it is a Georgia State Park now, but it's still basically like it's managed like a private conservation area. So they don't allow camping in there, for example. So they close those gates at night and no one's in there. The public has to leave. So it's a big protected area. There's no hunting in state parks, although they do allow some sort of deer hunting here and there in this park. But I think mostly it's for like youth groups or special use things. So I'm like talking out loud about, oh, it was in this protected area. It probably radiates out of there at night, because adjacent to it are these large agricultural plots in and amongst the hills and foothills of the Appalachians. And so you've still got forested hills leading into the forested mountains and all that, but there's a bunch of big pastures. If you follow the creek out of that conservation area and cross the road, eventually you're going to hit a bunch of pastures, and they're always full of deer. So I was like, oh, it must have been heading towards that. Blah, blah, blah. I'm talking like a million miles an hour. And she just cut me off, and she was like, have you ever seen one? And I was like, oh, no, I haven't. And she got kind of upset, and she goes, well, then you don't understand. You don't know. I thought I was going to die. And so I really kind of recoiled, because I realized like the only reason she agreed to talk to me about it, and I've had many conversations with her since then, but she had tried to tell people in her life about this, and they didn't believe her. They thought, oh, you just saw a bear, or oh, you saw a shadow. And so I think she had kind of given up, because by the time I interviewed her, several years had passed since the sighting, and she had just given up on talking about it. And so it became clear to me, like, she just wanted me to understand how frightening it was for her, because it didn't do anything like behaviorally frightening. It didn't come after her or do anything aggressive. It was just like, she's just driving home on Thanksgiving. She had taken some food over to her daughter's place and was just driving home. And this thing steps out of nowhere and totally shook her up. She says the biggest animal she's ever seen. I remember she said, she's like, have you ever been driving and someone swerves into your lane and you think you're about to have a head-on collision? And I was like, yeah, I've had that experience. And she's like, that's what it felt like. Like your stomach just ties up in a knot and you think something bad's about to happen. Like, I thought I was going to die. What is this? What is this thing? What's it doing here? That's not a man. It's not a bear. What is it? What is it? Am I in danger? And then it left, and that has always stuck with me in my experience too, with many, many witnesses. Like, they just want to be understood. They just want to tell someone what they went through, not just what they saw, but what they experienced, and have someone say, like, I hear you, I believe you, instead of laughter and ridicule or dismissal or something like that. So that one's always stuck with me among many. But again, that's just so close to home, literally, that's my mind goes to that one a lot.
Yeah, that is a pretty fantastic one. I'm hoping one of these, because obviously, when a lot of people, when they see things like this, especially when they're not like preparing for it at all, like people who personally go and look for these things, obviously in mind of like, all right, I have it in my vision, I want to see one, I want to see one. But when then you have these people who have no thought about Bigfoot at all, and then all of a sudden this tall, hairy creature walks in front of them, and they're like questioning everything about their lives, and there's like, wait, I can't comprehend this. I don't know what this is. I'm scared, and because they're not used to it. I'm hoping one of these days when Bigfoot is officially confirmed to be a real living species, and sure, they're not like, just because if Bigfoot will be confirmed at one point doesn't necessarily mean, oh, all of a sudden we're gonna start seeing them a lot more. We're still gonna have the same problem of people still seeing these things, but it'll still be at least like, like at least people will be like aware that it does exist. And I'm hoping that when that time does come, even though we won't be seeing them more, hopefully people will be more at least accustomed to the idea of like, hey, there's a very slight chance you might see this thing, and they'll be a bit more not as scared about it, especially if nothing happens like a situation like that. If it just she just saw it, it looked at her, and then it just went away, kind of thing. So I'm hoping we get to that at some point when in the future when Bigfoot is confirmed.
Yeah, I think shows like Finding Bigfoot help with that a lot in just spreading awareness because, for people like in her situation, again, this was the late 90s, 1999 when she had that sighting. And so, yeah, there's Bigfoot media, there'd been movies and documentaries, but it's all centered around the Pacific Northwest. And folks didn't really, it wasn't like a widespread thing that people took very seriously. And so I think there's something becomes even more shocking. The unknown or the novel or the new are shocking enough. But when those things emerge in what you've psychologically and experientially mapped as explored territory, they're even more shocking. So, for example, like if the analogy I always use is if we found some habitable Earth like planet covered in forest and sent you there, you would know, like, I'm entering unexplored territory, and you'd be mentally prepared to see things that no human's ever seen. So, you would at least enter into that world with like a certain level of awareness and attention, and like you would expect the unexpected versus you've lived in this area your whole life. You've driven this road thousands of times, or whatever the case may be. You've never seen anything other than deer and possums and raccoons and the occasional black bear. You're in explored territory where nothing unknown can or will manifest itself. And then all of a sudden, boom, you're confronted with this thing that is completely shocking because they're not easily categorizable because they shatter so many categories. Like it's sort of man shaped, but it's definitely not a human. It's animal like and it's covered with hair, but it's not a deer, it's not a bear, it's not any animal you've seen before. They're very large, and so that alone is incredibly frightening and intimidating. I mean, the oldest fear that we carry as mammals is of large frightening animals because we're all here because by some miracle our ancestors, the lineage that produced you managed to not get eaten by bigger scarier animals before they passed on their genes. And so we're hardwired to be afraid of those things. And so when you have that combination of the unknown in a category defying form that's large and frightening all at once inside of explored territory, somewhere that you weren't expecting the unknown to happen, that's really shocking to people's systems. And so then they carry that shock around. Again, her words, she said, I thought I was going to die. Now she's basically describing like the feeling was similar to feelings where, doom was impending, like almost getting in a head on collision or something like that. Same sort of physiological response. And then carrying that, like, who do I talk to about this? I don't know if anyone will believe me. And I personally witnessed, I don't want to tread on anybody's privacy, but I personally witnessed people in her life laughing at her telling the story, rolling their eyes and laughing.
Oh.
And I had to sit there and say, well, hey, here's what you need to know, and try to give like a quick 5-minute dissertation on the history of large apes in Asia, like Gigantopithecus, and how they could have gotten into North America, and the history of sightings across North America, but specifically the history of sightings and evidence in southern Appalachia. And that, like, she's not the only person who claims to see one just because you've never heard other stories. Like, she's not alone in this. Many credible people have claimed to see it. But, like, I saw her, by someone who was a major part of her life laughing at her all those years later and saying, like, oh, you did not see that. You saw a bear. I can't believe she doesn't know what a bear is. And you know what? They'd seen plenty of bears because North Georgia's loaded with them. And she owned a business in town, and like, you can see bears in town all the time. I remember another visit. I took a friend there, and he's like, I've never seen a bear. And I was like, oh, I guarantee you we'll see one this weekend because I see them all the time. And we're out at a restaurant in this town on the patio. Like 5 minutes later, I hear people like, oh my God, look, look, look. We look across the parking lot and there's a bear walking around in town. I was like, oh, there's your bear. We didn't even have to go camping yet to see one. So she would have known the difference between a bear and something else. And so, because she had no prior context, I think, you have a decision tree in your mind, that's implicit. And of course you can elaborate on it as you learn, but, pre finding Bigfoot in your life, let's say, or you were kind of interested in cryptids and those things, but let's say for the average person, if they go out in the dark and they hear a sound, the decision tree that pops up in their mind is like bear, deer, elk, moose, raccoon, coyote, wolf, just depending on where in North America they are. Like, most of those people don't have undiscovered ape, Sasquatch on their decision tree. So it's not even an option for them when they're trying to make sense of what they're hearing. So that's one thing. But then when you see something, which is much different than just hearing it, and it's like, what is that? Versus if culturally you did have that in your decision tree, that like, hey, whether you think they're real or not, here's what a Sasquatch supposedly is. Here's what it looks like. Many people claim to have seen them. Many people have found and documented tracks that are attributed to them. You should just be aware of these things. Had she been like wholly aware of all those things when she saw it, she would have been like, oh my God, that's a Sasquatch, and it would have saved a lot of that cognitive shock and physiological shock. I mean, it'd still be shocking, but probably not to the same degree. And then she probably would have felt differently about disclosing it to people, because she would have been able to, instead of like telling her close family or peers, she could have reached out to something like the BFRO or some other organization where there would be a sympathetic ear. People go, oh yeah, we're always looking to talk to people who might have seen one, and it would have just been a very different experience. So I think a show like Finding Bigfoot that gets so widely watched, like, most people know what a Sasquatch, quote unquote, is, even if they think they're not real, but they could go like, well, here's what a Sasquatch looks like and how it acts and what it supposedly eats and what their tracks are supposedly like, because they've been exposed to things like the TV show. Even, again, regardless of whether or not they think the things exist in flesh and blood or not, but at least there's an awareness so that if someone saw one, they'd know what they were seeing. Because that's, some of the stories that stuck with me. There's two other ones that come to mind. One was a guy who worked with me in Seattle who had an encounter in North Carolina in the early 2000s. And then there was another guy I interviewed who had a really close encounter, probably one of the best looks at a Sasquatch of anyone I've ever talked to, through the windshield of a parked vehicle, where it approached his vehicle when he was inside of it. And both of those people had told me, and among many other witnesses, but those two in particular, again, had no real prior awareness. And what little awareness they did have was all about like this mythological creature that only lived in the Pacific Northwest. And so they both were like, I did not know what I saw. And it took weeks to realize, like, oh, what I saw was the same thing that people in the Northwest see, that they call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. So they didn't even make that connection, because they didn't expect, A, they didn't think they were real, but B, they'd never heard stories in North Carolina or New Hampshire. And so it's funny, these two totally disconnected people both said to me, like, man, for a while I thought maybe it was just something from out of this world, because there was just nothing else like it.
Yeah.
And I'd never heard any stories beforehand. And I never thought that they would be outside the Pacific Northwest. And then they slowly realized, like, oh, that's just an animal that lives out there. And it's the same animal that occurs in the Pacific Northwest. And so people really wrestle with that stuff, you know?
Hmm. Yeah, because I've heard and listened to so many stories. People, like either by reading them or someone like submitting something like an audio wise. People who've seen something, and are terrified to tell people because they don't want to get criticized for it and stuff like that. And that's actually something I mentioned on the show here, that like if you see something, like it's okay kind of thing. And that's also kind of why I also said the thing I said at CryptidCon after I mentioned my BFRO expedition and everything, telling people like, hey, it's like if you've seen something, Bigfoot or not, especially if you weren't planning to, it's not your fault. It's okay. Like just because like you didn't plan to see this thing, it just happened, and you can't get against yourself for seeing something like that. And I feel after I said that, because no one was raising their hand before I rose my hand, and I told everyone about my BFRO expedition. But then after that, a few people started raising their hands, and there were some people nearby me, but going like shaking their like nodding in agreement of like you're right, like well said. And I feel like I really got some people to like open up a little bit, because I bet there were some people who probably want to say something, but like, I'm not sure. Then after what I said, I think some people were like, huh, you know what? Let me share what I share. And so I think that definitely did help. And anyone who's listening, I say the same thing. It's all right if you've seen something. Like if anything, take from it and learn from it, and just be amazed and be thankful in some ways that you saw something that thousands of people wish that you saw what you saw. So it don't feel bad if you've seen something.
Absolutely. And I hope that would extend to, eventually people being more receptive to those in their lives who have seen something. Because I cannot tell you how many times part of my like standard questioning, I would always ask, like, did you ever think about reporting this to law enforcement or local media? Or did you ever tell anyone else in your life about this? And like the vast majority of people say they've almost told no one. Like the guy that worked with me in Seattle that saw one, he prefaced it. He said, I'm going to tell you something I've only ever told my father and my wife. And so I knew this was like heavy for this person. If he'd only told two people in his life about this thing he saw,
Yeah.
I've heard that kind of thing many times where, or someone tells one or two people in their lives and they just happen to be the wrong people and they get disbelieved, or just like, oh, you didn't see that, or oh, what were you drinking, or what were you smoking? And after that experience, they're like, well, I'm not telling anyone else now, because if my best friend or spouse or sibling won't believe me, why should I expect a stranger to? And so they just don't tell anybody, which is really, really unfortunate.
Yeah, most of the people I assume that do listen to my show are in some believers in some way, but every so often I do say like, hey, like if someone tells you something, they're confident, like, hey, I want to tell you about something I saw, like don't shoot them down because of it. Don't like, think negatively of them, or like, it's like people who've said that, if I feel like if I told someone, I might lose my job kind of thing, if it got to them kind of thing. I always tell people, it's like, be receptive to people who have seen something. Don't like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like, just don't take it out on them and make them feel bad about something that they saw. Like, if anything, and even if you may not have to believe it, but at least be supportive, and at least like oh sure, like I agree, you saw something. What it was, I don't know, but I support you, and thank you for telling me about this. So and I still even that's something I feel strongly about today. Like, don't be receptive to new ideas about certain things, and when it comes to this, and don't shoot people down because of it.
Absolutely.
So how are you doing with time today?
Oh, I've got a few more minutes here. It is
Okay,
Valentine's
because
Day. I'm sure you probably got Valentine's plans too.
yeah, I've got something later tonight, because I still have like another full page of questions, so that just means at some point I need to get you back here to do the rest of these questions because I've still got a bunch more. Let's see. There's anything else? Last thing I could say. Okay. Well, okay. This you may have already answered this one, but we'll make this one a little bit of a quick one. When did you personally just know that Bigfoot was real for you?
I would say the moment that I knew, it's hard to say because sometimes I think about there was this a great researcher named Richard Greenwell, and they were like, "Do you believe that Sasquatches exist?" And he had this super funny answer that I kind of relate to. He said, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm convinced that they exist. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I think it's all nonsense, and on Sundays, I rest." Because there is a blend of mistaken identity, misinterpretation. There are fabrications, there are hoaxes. There are people that are telling stories in order to get attention or some other gains. So I'm convinced that they exist. I think seeing one would be knowing in the sense of like true experiential knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, some days I feel like I know that they exist, and some days I feel like I know that they exist to like 99.9% certainty. I remember with Moneymaker, when I asked him about his first sighting, what his sighting was like, he said, I'll never forget this. He said, there's a big difference between being 99% sure and 100% sure that they exist. So I try to like make some space for that and go, yeah, I'm pretty sure, but I think if I saw one, I'd know. But the moment that I remember knowing, um, I'd had like my first experience. There was no visual involved, and then I was interviewing witnesses and finding a lot of historical information and going out in the field and having some like maybe things happen, some fairly exciting things. Um, but there was one night in particular, another dumb luck, right place, right time. Was out with friends scouting, and we were driving home. We were done. I was living in Atlanta at the time, so we're driving from the North Georgia mountains, going to head back home to Atlanta. And we're driving back home, and there was a Forest Service road that none of us had ever been down, just a little spur road. And we thought, you know what? Let's just go look at that real quick before we drive all the way back home. And so we drove down there, got out, we're kind of looking around. The sun was setting, it was dark, and let's do some calls. Let's just see what happens. And had this extended encounter with like wood knocks from three different positions and rocks being thrown. So it's like three of the things there knocking back and forth and throwing rocks. And that lasted at least half an hour, maybe up to an hour. I mean, it was just so exciting and exhilarating. And I just remember by the time I got home to Atlanta, it was probably 2 a.m. And I remember I called my dad, who was still practicing at the time. He had his own clinic and was like the small town doctor. And I woke him up in the middle of the night. And I said, they are real. They're real. I knew in that moment that there was no explanation that would have been as satisfactory than real living Sasquatches. And that, it was just so random. No one knew we were going there. There were no other people there. This was an old spur road that had like a big permanent gate at the end of it, and it even dead ended past that gate. So there's only one way in or out. It's in the middle of nowhere. There's nobody out there late at night. And we stayed there forever, and just thought, man, these things, that's a moment when I thought like, all this is not for nothing. Like there's definitely something very real to this. And there were five of us in that case. So five of us experienced that. So that I think would be like the moment that comes to mind to answer that question.
Oh, that's fantastic, and it's always because obviously everyone always has different. What was the thing for them kind of thing. Everyone, it's like, oh, when I saw one or I heard one or something. Everyone always has their own different way of how they knew that. Like, okay, well, I now know they exist. Sure, for most people, it's they've got to see one, and I completely understand that because believing it is seeing it. So when I see it, I'll believe it, kind of thing. So 100% agree with that. But yeah, that's very, very cool that you were able to have that experience to be able like, oh, I now know that I know these things are real, and I'm like, now next thing I gotta do, I just gotta see one, and that's the game that we know we're all playing in as Bigfoot researchers of trying to figure out, like, I know they're existing, and then I know they exist, and I have to do what I have to do, and now I just gotta see one, and it's just a matter of just if and when.
Exactly. Hopefully.
Hopefully, yes. All right. Well, I guess obviously, Matt, this has been fantastic. Obviously, of course, I still got a full page of notes, so and more questions I got to ask you. So that just means at some point in the future, you got to come back, and we got to get you as on here again, so I can keep asking you these questions and keep talking Sqautch, because I think I could literally go to a bar with you and talk about Sqautch with you for hours.
Yeah, we'll definitely do a part two, especially once I get home and settled and all that stuff, and then I won't have anything, no travel on the schedule or anything like that. We could definitely do a part two for sure.
Of course, yeah. Also, no rush or anything like that, because obviously I know you're a really busy man because you know of everything that you do. So, at some point in the future, we'll have to make sure we get a part two out here. So, I guess well, where can people follow you? Just keep track of what you do and stuff like that.
Yeah, the most updated place is going to be listening to Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo. I've always been on every call from the beginning because I produce and edit the show, but then they've had me kind of join as like a third semi co-host for, gosh, I guess that's been about a year now. And then on our members only show, which I cleverly titled Beyond Bigfoot and Beyond, I've co-hosted every episode of that podcast. So that's always the three of us and then occasionally a guest. So the members only show those, that's like weekly updates that we give. But then I do have a website at mattpruittonline.com. It's pretty sparse. I don't do much like social media online stuff. I occasionally tweet, or now it's X. It's not Twitter anymore. But
I still call it tweet. I don't care what it's called.
Yeah, exactly. So you can find me there at Pruitt Bigfoot. But I only tweet like 4 or 6 times a year. It's pretty rare. I don't use Facebook really. Like I have a Facebook, but I almost never use it. And same with Instagram. So yeah, probably Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo is the best place to keep up. Or you can reach out to me through mattpruittonline.com.
Awesome. Yeah, because actually like 2 weeks ago when I didn't have a voice, I decided to be, oh, you know what? Instead of me just saying, hey, there's no episode this week, I'll see you guys all next week, I was like, you know what? Let me suggest something. And I actually on the Facebook page of that I've got for the podcast, I actually recommended people going to Bigfoot and Beyond and listening to it.
Appreciate that.
Whether or not anyone did, but I at least it's my favorite podcast that I listen to, so I recommended it to anyone who follows me.
Greatly appreciate that.
Of course. So yeah, everyone, this was the amazing, fantastic Matt Pruitt joining us from Bigfoot and Beyond with Cliff and Bobo and all the fun stuff that he does. Like to thank him for joining us today and everything, and hopefully, and then sometime in the future, we will get him back here because I got some good questions that I didn't get a chance to talk to, and especially when I read more of your book, I definitely probably want to talk more about the stuff that was in it.
That would be great.
Awesome. So remember, everyone, keep your ears and eyes open for the creepiness in store, because you never know what you'll find outside of your door. This has been Cryptid Talk with special guest Matt Pruitt. Have a good day, everyone. Stay safe. Love you all.